Nikolai Petrovsky. I'm Professor of Medicine at Flinders University and Chairman and Researcher Director of a company, Vaxine Proprietary Limited. Role here is that we develop pandemic vaccines, and one of those vaccines, which has just been approved, is our protein-based Covax-19 vaccine that protects against COVID-19. But despite being a vaccine developer, I'm not in support of vaccine mandates, particularly at this point in time. I think it's too early. The technologies are still too young, and we need to know a lot more and do more science before we can be confident that the right thing is to have everyone vaccinated, whether they choose to or not. So I'm here, as I say, to support people having the right to choose at this stage which vaccine they want to have and whether they want to have a vaccine at this stage or not.
Nick Petrovsky, a professor of medicine, a physician and a professor of medicine, an entrepreneur who can speak with as much authority, I suspect, as anyone in the world. And again, I'm not indulging in hyperbole here. With as much authority as anyone in the world about each aspect of the medical tyranny. So he can speak to the question of the accuracy of PCR tests, or the inaccuracy of them, the uselessness of them, the extent to which they can be used by people who intend to mislead us about the state of an infection and the magnitude of risk presented by that infection. He can speak to the nature of the vaccines. He's produced a vaccine. He's produced his own vaccine. Unlike the other vaccines, unlike the 4 vaccines which are the only vaccines that you are permitted to take to comply with these tyrannous mandates, the 2 vector vaccines and the 2 mRNA vaccines. This is a protein vaccine which has none of the discrepancies and none of the disadvantage and none of the dangers that are associated with those vaccines, and he'll explain that. But he'll also be able to talk to us tonight perhaps, but can I say from my perspective, more importantly, he's been retained as our expert consultant. How lucky are we to have him? But it's wonderful to have Nick on board. I'll shut up now so you can hear the authority with which he speaks. Over to Nick.
So I guess to start with, I should declare my conflicts. And of course, one of those, or one of the paradoxes, is I am a vaccine developer. Our vaccine has completed its full clinical trial development overseas, because it was forced overseas, unfortunately. It has completed it, and it's been approved in Iran, of all places, just about a week ago to be rolled out. And we're hoping, obviously, we'll go from there to rolling it out in a lot of other countries around the world. Maybe even Australia one day, but that's actually the biggest question mark, because we aren't the anointed, or we haven't paid enough fees to certain people in Canberra to ensure that our vaccine is supported. So, as I say, I might declare that as a conflict. I should also declare as a conflict that, I similarly won't be in my role at Flinders Medical Centre on Monday, because I've not agreed to have one of the TGA mandated vaccines. Now, and I guess this is where it really gets complicated as a vaccine developer, someone who for 20 years has spent every working day developing vaccines for situations like this and for other situations, not just pandemics. And fortunately, over that 20 years, we've had unequivocal support from the US government, no less. The National Institutes of Health have funded all of our work. not so much the Australian government. But, you know, because I'm passionate about vaccines, you know, obviously it's hard when I have to say that as a vaccine developer, I am not fully confident about what's happened over the last 18 months. And I'm not the only vaccine developer in the world who is extremely uncomfortable right now. And as I say, that's really hard to say because it could be misconstrued, but it's a fact. And we have a situation where we have some very new technologies in their infancy, and that is the mRNA vaccines and the adenoviral vector vaccines, which are the only ones that you're being forced to have, or certainly some of us are being forced to have, to remain in employment. And the question around, well, what level of confidence do we have that they have been through the usual process, which is usually 10 to 15 years of rigorous testing in, you know, just thousands of people. Now, those thousands of people accept the risk because they're in a clinical trial. They're given a very extensive warning, this could kill you, this could maim you, and they still sign up and agree to that process, and then they're followed for 5, 10, 15 years. And if they survive and there are no terrible occurrences, then regulators will, you know, look at all of that data and approve the product. Now, that hasn't happened in this situation, which is really a first. And so, you know, we all have to sit back and say, well, you know, should then everyone who gets these vaccines be signing an informed consent form as if they're in a clinical trial? Now, my personal perspective is, you know, first, no harm, and two, the principles of informed consent. You know, we have the Nuremberg Code. And so where you have a situation, yes, you may accelerate things and develop a vaccine very rapidly, and it's still, you know, there's uncertainties, but then you have to tell people the honest truth. I can't tell you whether, you know, in 10 years there will be a side effect of an mRNA vaccine or there won't be. No one can. Maybe God can, if you believe in him, but in truth, no scientist can. And so if they can't, how can they mandate something which has that level of uncertainty around it? You have to get informed consent. So rather than mandates, which as I say, I think are completely abhorrent in this situation, there should be informed consent forms so that everyone having one of these vaccines is getting all of the information and then saying, of my free will, not under duress, I am signing and agreeing to have this vaccine. And we're going to force you to do something that you're not comfortable with doing. And as a doctor, I just, that's somewhere I'm not going to go. Just because the state tells you to do something doesn't mean it's right, and I think we really need to question that. So, as I say, it's a complex situation. I'm pro-vaccines, but ultimately they have to be given, I think, if in this situation, with informed consent. And certainly you cannot mandate something that is still experimental, in my view, where you don't know the long-term outcomes and risks, no matter how small they are. Because when we sign informed consents in clinical trials, we don't think what we're going to be doing is going to be killing people, but we have to say a possibility is that this thing we're giving you might kill you. Because that's the principle of informed consent. The risk is immaterial. It might be a 1 in a million risk in that clinical trial. We still have to put it in black and white. In fact, often they ask you to bold it, you know, this might kill you, highlight it, and we're going, but this is really a harmless treatment we're giving. They're going, no, this is informed consent. You have to highlight even the remotest risk. And so that's why I'm a bit scandalised. As I say, one, we're not following a principle of informed consent. Two, we're actually mandating this in the absence of informed consent, and I just have serious ethical problems with that situation. Now, how do I feel about my vaccine? Well, again, protein-based vaccines have been around for now 50 years. All the vaccines our children get at birth and onwards are protein-based vaccines. So although, of course, COVID is a new protein, it still shares the properties and behaviours, and it's made in the same way that we make those safe vaccines that we give to our children, which I think, most people accept are unbelievably safe and proven. And so although we've modified it specifically to make it effective against COVID, we can rely to a large extent on that 50 years of experience in tens of billions of young children to say protein-based vaccines are the best vaccines we have. It still doesn't say they don't have side effects, because every treatment, every vaccine has side effects, but they're quantifiable, and we can tell people these are the risks and these are the probabilities of you getting those side effects. We can't say that with new vaccines where we simply don't have the data. And so, as I say, I think if we did have protein-based vaccines, doesn't have to be mine, it could be Novavax or Sanofi or whoever, I think it would be completely different context. But here, everyone's being forced to select something that, where we don't know actually a lot about it. We don't know why is mRNA creating myocarditis. No scientist in the world I've met can explain it. If we don't know, we know it's causing a side effect, we don't know how it's causing a side effect, what else don't we know? It's too early, and most of us didn't ever think mRNA would get approved at any time in the next 5 to 10 years. We certainly didn't expect to see it being mandated that everyone on the planet have it. I mean, as I say, those of us within the industry have been truly shocked by the speed at which this has happened and the aggressiveness of the campaign to make everyone take something that most of us still see as largely an experimental therapy. And we don't know the ultimate outcome of that experiment. So, as I say, take it on board. I don't want to shock people, but, I think we need to just look at it in perspective. Yes, we need vaccines for this pandemic as part of the strategy, but we have to be careful. First, do no harm. And I'm not sure how we can be confident about that in the current situation, particularly when people aren't getting a choice and people aren't providing informed consent. And that's the principle of modern democracy, is always informed consent, and I don't see it happening here and now. So I'm happy to take any questions. So first, to address the second question, is saying there hasn't been a successful coronavirus vaccine before. In fact, at least in animal models, we had a very successful SARS coronavirus vaccine that we've published. We've also had a successful MERS coronavirus vaccine which protected camels and alpacas against MERS. So they didn't get tested in humans, but even in large animals they were highly protective. So no, it's not true that there haven't been successful coronavirus vaccines before, but neither of those problems have necessitated a human vaccine, fortunately, and touch wood, they won't. If they do, we'll have a SARS or a MERS vaccine out there in a few weeks because we've already developed it. Now, in terms of the issue of the spike proteins, a lot of people get confused about this. So the spike protein is the protein that projects out of the virus, that the virus uses to attach to the cells in our nose and then invade and infect those cells. So in order to block the virus and stop it causing an infection, every vaccine essentially has to target the spike protein in some way, to induce antibodies, which are proteins in our blood that recognise the spike protein. So when a virus comes into our nose, immediately these antibodies latch onto the spike protein and actually stop the spike protein binding to our cells, and then the virus gets washed into our stomach, killed by acid, and we don't get infected and we don't get sick. So the spike protein is essential to all COVID vaccines. It was essential to our SARS vaccine, it was essential to our MERS vaccine. And there's no evidence that the spike protein as a protein is harmful. I can tell you, I've injected myself with a lot of spike protein over the years, right? In itself, it's not harmful. What's different about the genetic vaccines, so whether it's adenovirus or mRNA, is they reprogram our own cells internally to make spike protein. So whereas when we inject spike protein, it's an inert protein, it's like egg white. I mean, it basically does nothing much. We inject it, it's outside the cells of our body. It doesn't affect our body's cellular machinery or its genetic machinery. It just stimulates our B cells to make antibodies. The difference is with these new vaccines is that they only work because they put new genes into the cells in the body. That's why they're called genetic vaccines. And those genes then switch on once they're inside those cells to make those cells, instead of making other proteins, now make spike protein. But they're now making spike protein inside your cell, essentially by tricking the cell and its genetic machinery. Now that can have many, many consequences that you won't see injecting a spike protein as a protein, even though they're trying to do the same thing, which is induce antibodies against the spike protein. But that difference is enormous, believe me. You know, having something making spike protein inside a cell compared to injecting spike protein outside a cell is just worlds apart. Well, the virus has been isolated. We've done it, and every lab in the world pretty well has done it by now, and there's a genetic sequence of the virus, and we actually designed our first vaccine back in January last year because there was no virus in Australia at the time, from the genetic sequence that the Chinese published, because they were the only ones who had the virus and they weren't going to share the virus with anyone because they were madly trying to make vaccines and exploit that situation. So we can characterise the virus. We can't actually grow the virus in Adelaide because we don't have an appropriate biosecurity facility, but our collaborators in Sydney who have a BSL facility, they grow virus from each person who comes into Australia, because the way they get their viruses is all the travellers come from different countries bearing different variants of the virus. They collect the viruses, they culture the viruses, they characterise the viruses. So no, I mean, the virus is real and its effects are real. Fortunately, in young people, the virus is nowhere near as lethal as it is in elderly people or people with chronic disease. People with diabetes, it's about a 20% mortality rate, particularly if they have other comorbidities. People over 80, there's a 20% mortality rate. Gets into our nursing home, every fifth person is going to die in a few weeks. That's what happened in Victoria. They lost about 1,000 people from 2 or 3 nursing homes getting infected. I mean, this virus is a really nasty virus. I don't think we should belittle it, but it does pick off particular groups. And so if you said mandate vaccine in everyone over 60, even with a genetic vaccine, you might say, well, there's a risk-benefit there. They're so old. If it caused cancer in 30 years, so what? It's not a problem for them. But, if it stops them having a 1 in 5 chance of dying from this virus, wow, I can justify that. I have no problem with that. Can I justify giving exactly the same vaccine to my children? when I don't know what the effects, might be in 20, 30 years? Absolutely not. So what I'm saying is, it's not being anti these vaccines, even these genetic vaccines, but putting them, in the appropriate context where the benefits outweigh the risks. And that uncertainty I mentioned, you can say we can accept that uncertainty because the benefit is so great. If I had a 1 in 5 chance of dying of something and someone said, I can give you an experimental treatment, I would grab it. But if someone said, you've got a 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 chance of dying with this, and I want to give you something, could be, quite noxious, of course you're not going to do it. So it's all about that risk-benefit, and I don't think our policymakers in any way are explaining this is all about risk-benefit. There are some people where you can justify doing just about anything, and there are other people where you can justify really doing nothing. And as I say, I'm particularly concerned about the drive to give these vaccines to young children, because I think it is way too early, about a decade too early to be doing that.
Announced that DCP have given blanket consent for all children and young people under guardianship between the ages of 12 to 16 to be vaccinated. So they're encouraging vaccinations for young people. They're encouraging their teams to facilitate these young people to say yes to the vaccine. So just wanted to let you know that and share that, because that's very serious. I got another message today of yet another child taken from a parent, and for those of you who know me, I'm been part of this vaccine community, vaccination information essay, for a long time, and children are being taken from families, and it is based on their vaccination status, among other things. So these children now in the care of DCP, with the parents fighting to get them back, are now apparently blanket consent has been given by someone else to jab them all. And we need to do something about this.
COVID does kill people, particularly vulnerable people, and so we do need vaccines to protect those people. The big issue here is, do we need vaccines for everyone, and if so, which vaccines, and should people have informed consent and a right to decide, which vaccine strategy they want to go for. So I don't think there's any right or wrong, and there's certainly, you can't say these viruses are harmless, because they're not. So certainly we vaccinate, the whole population against hepatitis B, and it's been amazingly effective at establishing herd immunity and eradicating hepatitis B in many countries, not all countries. That's still a way to go. But there we know that the virus doesn't really mutate. It's a very stable virus over decades. And so we use the same hepatitis B vaccine now that we used 50 years ago, and it's still effective. So we have to distinguish those examples where, we have a very stable virus, we have a very effective vaccine. If we get everyone on the planet vaccinated, the virus ceases to exist. We managed to do it with smallpox. We're very close to doing it with polio. But those viruses are quite different to Covid-19, which is an RNA virus, which means it mutates much more rapidly. It gets around those defences. We're not going to be able to keep the same vaccine going for decades upon decades. That's guaranteed. When will we need to change the vaccine, and how often, we don't know. But it's unlikely now. I think we've lost the opportunity to eradicate COVID-19. If we'd been very fast early last year and had, effective quarantine, isolation, testing, obviously a vaccine was unlikely in that time frame, but we could have controlled it. We eradicated SARS from the human race. We had an outbreak of a much more lethal coronavirus. 10% of people died. So 1 in 10 people who got SARS, including young people, doctors, nurses, all died from SARS. It was completely eradicated actually by quarantine, lockdowns, testing. That's all, because there was no vaccine. So we missed the opportunity with COVID. We should have done it, but it didn't happen. Now I think we're going to have to live with it. And that means that, yes, vaccination, and getting immunity in the community up will help. Certainly to protect the elderly, I think it's going to be obligatory to vaccinate them regularly, because I don't see any other way to protect those very vulnerable people. The issue then becomes, what about, the rest? I believe in choice. I think vaccines are good. I don't think that, people should just say, oh, they're all bad. But I think people still have to make that ultimate choice, and many things in life are a choice. But I would hope most people would ultimately, if offered a good vaccine, would accept it. But I'm not sure we're there yet.
To go over with that.
So we don't know how long any vaccines will provide protection for. In fact, we know that the mRNA vaccine protection is wearing off much more rapidly than people initially thought. So hence why people are having third and fourth doses, just 4 or 5 months after having a primary course, and that's caught everyone by surprise. Now, is that a feature of this particular virus, that it's harder to maintain protection against? Is it a feature of the mRNAs? Well, we don't know, because we've never tested these before in humans. So maybe it's just a problem of the mRNA, and if you had a protein-based vaccine, as we've seen with hepatitis B, you're protected for life. So I can't tell you. I mean, it's only, and again, we have to collect data over time. Will our vaccine last 5 years? Well, we'll only know in 5 years' time. We can make guesses and informed guesses based on our research, on our experience with flu vaccines, with, our animal testing. But ultimately, we need time, because you can't replace time, in an experiment or in a situation where you don't know the answers. So we don't know what will happen to COVID in 2 years' time. It might become a very lethal virus. COVID could suddenly overnight go from killing, 2% of people to killing 20% of people. It might do the opposite. It might go and become a very benign virus. It might skip around the vaccine and become completely resistant to the current vaccines. We can't know any of those things until we experience them. So there is a high level of uncertainty, and asking for certainty makes no sense, because, it's too early, if that makes sense. So we hope, we obviously hope our vaccine lasts longer than the mRNA vaccines, but I can't tell you that, because I need time to see what the data shows. Well, certainly, mixing and matching vaccines has been happening for long periods of time. When you have a flu shot, you'll get a different brand, different years. You don't care whether it's the same brand and the same type of vaccine. They all work, and it doesn't seem to matter what order you have them in. I think that already there's data with COVID vaccines that similarly you can actually mix and match, and in many cases that probably gives you better immunity than having, certainly, the same thing time and time again may not be the best approach. So we do already have some human data on that, where it does look like mixing and matching actually can be beneficial, but it's early days again, so there's no right or wrong. And in Australia, people are still in the process of having their first shot, so I don't think too many Australians are in a situation where they need to think about what's my booster and what do I want to have as my booster. That will come, of course, in coming months. Yeah, our vaccine's pretty simple. It has the spike protein as a protein. It has a plant sugar called inulin, which is used in health foods, and that's a critical turbocharger for the vaccine. It has a synthetic sugar called an oligonucleotide, which has helped to, again, act as a bit of a turbocharger. It has salt water, which the vaccine is suspended in. And then it has a tiny amount of a detergent called Tween 80, which is commonly used in vaccines to stabilise the protein and stop it sticking to the glass vial so that it remains in the solution. So that's essentially what's the total contents of our vaccine. There's no heavy metals. In fact, we put it through atomic mass spectroscopy to quantitate any heavy metals or other contaminants, and they all have to be parts per billion, which it always is. So we verify that. Again, most vaccines, protein-based vaccines would have the same constituents, as I say. The key ones being the salt water, which is the stabiliser. Often a little bit of the detergent, particularly Tween 80 is the most commonly used one. And then where we're different is a lot of vaccines have aluminium hydroxide, which is used as an adjuvant. Instead, we use plant sugar because we felt that was a more natural alternative. But, as I say, there's no secrets. Or there shouldn't be any secrets about what's in a vaccine, because you have to tell that to the regulator when you get your vaccine approved. The only sort of evidence I've seen that would suggest some effect on the immune system is there seems to be a lot of reactivation of herpes zoster in people who've had the mRNA vaccines, and that's reported in most of the safety databases, and it does seem to be more frequent than what we'd expect or see with other vaccines. Now, herpes zoster is a virus, chickenpox, so once you've had chickenpox, if you haven't been vaccinated, then you have chickenpox in your body for the whole of your life. And if your immune system becomes depressed for any reason, you get cancer or you have immunosuppressive treatment, then the virus will reactivate from the nerve cells where it's hiding, and that will cause this outbreak of herpes zoster. So the fact that mRNA vaccines seem in some people to be triggering reactivation of that does suggest it's doing something to the immune system, but beyond that I wouldn't comment. I haven't seen any sort of hard data. So I think certainly we know if we give a protein injection, that protein is degraded and removed within a few weeks, so it's very fast. What we know with the mRNA, because again there have been some papers published on this, is that they can still detect spike protein being produced 4 months after the injection, suggesting that somewhere in the body, some cells are still being programmed to produce spike protein. Now, which cells and where in the body, because you have to remember when you get this injection, it's injected into the muscle, but because it's in a lipid particle, so it's sort of like in a stealth particle, which was designed to make it live longer, means it gets distributed, throughout the body, and it's taken up by different cells differently. Look, and again, the idea is not to make people uncomfortable or panic people. So when we talk about potential risks or outcomes, we're talking things that might be incredibly rare and may never happen. I hope that it turns out mRNA is fabulous and it has no long-term consequences. Do you know what I mean? That's my hope. But if you said, can I vouch for that? Can I guarantee that? No one on this planet can guarantee that, because we don't know, because it hasn't been long enough. Well, the answer is fall in behind them, fund, legal actions to challenge the validity of those mandates. And, if people are not comfortable, yes, you have to accept some consequences. It's not going to be easy, but don't capitulate into doing the wrong thing and regretting it for the rest of your lives. I mean, that's what we tell our kids, is if you really feel, your gut feel is this isn't what I should be doing, my advice is don't do it. Now that may have consequences, you may get victimised. Some of us have already been victimised, and I know a lot more are going to get victimised. Hopefully we can fight back, but we ourselves will never regret the action we took. First no regret.
Patient man behind you as well.